welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be doing a deep dive into the Auburn Tigers, particularly their upset towards losing to UCal this past Saturday, and also just some general analysis on what exactly is missing from this Auburn team and what can we expect moving forward in terms of some games coming up, as well as what should the overall expectation should be given the first two games that we've seen this season. Now, I did not get a chance to do a deep dive into Auburn like I expected. I was expecting another analyst to, come on and be able to help me with that segment. But in any event, I mean, Auburn has always been one of those teams where, you look back and you remember the days of Cam Newton and Gene Chizik and all of those guys. So it definitely brings a lot of fond memories. And when you think about this Hugh Freeze hire, he's going to this Hugh Freeze going into his second year, and this definitely is a big season for him in the sense of he came he was with Liberty before, and he had some of those recruiting violations and all the rumors and et cetera, et cetera. And obviously everybody knows that their history with Ole Miss, but you know, I think there are a lot more expectations this year than kind of what we saw compared to last year. But at the same time, what is a little bit concerning to me is I'm seeing a lot of parallels to the team this year compared to last year. In particular, a lot of the same sort of struggles that they had last year that they really had to kind of overcome in order to even get to a bowl game. Now, I will note they did play UCal last year and they won 14-10, and it kind of was in the beginning of the season where, for the most part, the offense was pretty sloppy in general. I mean, even if you watched, even some of the Auburn game, it was really hard to watch in terms of getting that offense together. They looked sluggish, lackluster. I mean, Payton Thorne was just not there at all. I mean, even on that first drive, if it wasn't for that ball just hitting the ground a little bit, I mean, that was going to be a pick six right there. And he also threw 4 interceptions outside of that too. And I'll be the first one to say, hey, the first 4 weeks of the college football season, I mean, my guess is as good as anybody else's in terms of who are the teams that are actually going to end up being that we're talking about in December too, because every sports podcast or analyst is going to tell you something a little different too. And at the end of the day, the preseason polls, I mean, I do believe that the polls are valuable and everything, but at the same time, you have to take those with a grain of salt too, because that's really more or less is kind of the platform or the jumping off point to really discuss these teams and to determine who really are the best 12 teams that will ultimately represent the FBS college football playoff, as well as ultimately the bowl games that you have as well too. And going back to the comparison between 23 and 24, I mean, obviously some things have changed on the offensive side. I'll briefly summarizing it. I mean, last year you did have Phillip Montgomery, who was the coach of Tulsa for 7 seasons from 2015 to 2022. So you had him calling plays, and he was ultimately relieved after one season. And now you see Hugh Freeze calling plays now. And I think what startled me the most about the difference between Montgomery's play calling versus Hugh Freeze is I think in many ways, I think Hugh Freeze is kind of having the same syndrome as Sean Payton in the NFL, where I think Payton Thorne is experienced to the point where I think he definitely has to step up a little bit? Absolutely. I mean, even going into this year, there were definitely some serious questions at quarterback. And, everybody knows too, Auburn has NIL money. They are not fooling anybody. So for, Auburn and Hugh Freeze to say, hey, we're comfortable with Payton Thorne and we're not going to go out and get a transfer, we're all sitting around looking around saying, hey, we expect a serious progression from year to year, given that you're rolling the dice with Payton Thorne again, especially when you went out and you got Lambert Smith from Penn State. You also have Percy Lewis, who transferred from Mississippi State, helping you out on the offensive line. So they definitely brought in a couple transfers to accelerate that growth on the offensive side of the ball too. But when you have those same sort of struggles from 2023 to 2024, it definitely is a little bit alarming too, because I think, quite frankly, what I saw from the game this Saturday is I felt they were asking way too much out of Payton Thorne. I definitely wanted to kind of see him be a little bit more kind of, instead of throwing into the fire. I think they were asking him to make way too many different reads. I think a lot of it were on his plate, and I definitely, at least for the beginning portion of the game, definitely, try to get some different looks. Maybe, you know, try a little bit of play action or running the ball, or even get those tight ends involved too. I mean, obviously, primarily Hugh Freeze is going to be running more of a sort of a spread offense, so a lot of it is contingent on Thorne being able to take pressure and being able to make those deep balls. But at the same time, too, the rest of the team has to be set up around them to be in order to facilitate that as well. And overall, I mean, I do think California UCal is a better team than people give them credit for. I mean, Justin Wilcox has been there for an extended period of time, and they've always been kind of a perennial sort of 5 to 8 win squad. But I think, especially, they had a big chip on their shoulder. I mean, they're going to the ACC. They've definitely a lot of more pressure on them traveling to the East. I guess I'll call it the East Coast for this game too, and it's definitely a big win for them. I mean, I would definitely say to an extent that this is an upset too. But if you looked at some of the football indexes and some of the statistics as well, a lot of people, at least statistically speaking, it was a bad matchup for Auburn in that regard. But at the same time, I would like to make the argument that I think Auburn has improved drastically compared to last season. And I do think, as the season progresses, I do think we're going to see more of that. But obviously, much like Missouri and Brady Cook, I think a lot of what's going to be predicated regarding Auburn's success and how much better can they get than 6-7 is going to be obviously dependent on how do they fare in some of those big time matchups that they're going to have in a couple weeks, and also how do you get Payton Thorne more comfortable, because I saw him under distress for the most part. I don't think he's able to go through his reads as thoroughly or as cohesively as you would expect to, especially if you watched any spring ball too. I mean, he definitely looked like he was going to have a command of this offense too. So it definitely, needless to say, is a little bit concerning, seeing all that too. But I think also too, jumping into this point, I mean, I do think that this week coming up versus New Mexico is a really good opportunity for Auburn to be able to bounce back, and also, hopefully get a stronger grasp in terms of what can this Auburn offense look like, full cylinder, ready to go. I mean, they do play New Mexico, and, well documented last season with New Mexico State just whooping their ass last season with Diego Pavia and Jerry Kill, who were now over at Vanderbilt doing their thing over there. But I think Auburn's definitely going to come into this game with a chip on their shoulder. Now, granted, before I get into the X's and O's of what we want to see from Auburn in this game, but I'd like to even just throw a little bit of credit to a smaller school, New Mexico, here. I mean, obviously, a very difficult place to win given the given the recruiting and the NIL. They're getting poached from various states. You're not getting as much in-state talent, so you're competing with the Californias of the world and Nevadas, digging a little bit of Texas and also Arizona as well. But also, they did take what I think was a pretty bold hire in going after Bronco Mendenhall, who has extensive history as a head coach, particularly at Boise State. He was out of football for a couple seasons, but when I first saw that hire, I was really excited to see that too, because if anybody can turn around a program, I'm telling you, it's him. He's fierce, he's passionate, he's always had a really strong understanding of you know of the fundamentals that I think New Mexico definitely needs, because you know especially at a program like that, you really do need an extended time to really kind of build that culture and build that foundation before you really go out and try to win games and spend significant money in the NIL and all that stuff. Because at this point, you really just want to do your best to get to a bowl game and make the games at least somewhat entertaining. So before now, with that said, going back to Auburn, I think one of the things that we saw that we didn't see with New Mexico, which is why I think that this Auburn game will be a really good showcase for him, is New Mexico has not really played a single ounce of defense whatsoever these past 2 weeks. They did play Arizona the week before, and I think they gave up 60 something against them. And then week 0 they did play Montana State, who they almost won that game too, but ultimately Montana State ended up coming back. So they were Montana State is an FCS powerhouse anyway, so they were favored. But in any event, I do think that this game will really be telling in terms of what can we what can we see from this Auburn team, and most importantly, I was I even said this to myself when I heard the news that Hugh Freeze calling plays. Is I think having Hugh Freeze calls those plays definitely brings a lot more significant attention, in the sense that there is a much deeper sense of urgency in order to win immediately. Now, obviously, Auburn's fans have never been super patient, even when you think of Brian Hartson before, and some of the coaches there in general. So it's not always there. It's definitely not the type of fan base that's going to give you a lot of time, but very passionate, I might want to add. But in any event, I do think that if in order for Hugh Freeze to say, hey, after one season, letting go of Phillip Montgomery, there were definitely some things that he felt like he could just simply do better too. And obviously, the little Hugh Freeze history, that was the first season that he's ever decided, hey, I'm not going to call plays on offense. And you know, there were times where you know, there were definitely some questions in terms of that offense in general. So I can't say we were all too surprised to see Hugh Freeze deciding to not call to be calling plays now. But I think what's also very strong about that move as well is Hugh Freeze has always been a phenomenal recruiter. He's that's the one, I think that's arguably his biggest strength outside of his offensive prowess. But he did go out and get DJ Durkin as his defensive coordinator. He has extensive history in the SEC, so that should help a lot in the recruiting front, being familiar with the SEC. Obviously, with his history at Texas A&M, he was a head coach in Maryland for a while, so he's well traveled, well respected, and particularly, he spent a lot of time coaching the defensive line as well. So it's definitely not surprising that you have that type of person leading the defense too. Because if you do expect Hugh Freeze to primarily be focused on offense, you do need that strong, bold hire such as DJ Durkin, who has that history and can definitely be trusted to facilitate all that. And you know, I do think to some degree there is a question in terms of the overall talent on the Auburn roster. I mean, I will say in general, I do think this is a younger team, and I think we're going to see that throughout the season, particularly towards the middle and the end, when they are playing some of those tougher matchups going into late October, early November. But I do think from what I've seen, and hopefully what we'll see against New Mexico, is that we're going to see some of those foundational pieces really coming together, and hopefully it definitely alleviates some of the early concerns that we're seeing with the offense, particularly against UCal, and a lot of those similarities that we saw at the beginning of 2023